There we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Yossi Lichterman. I'm the Communication and Editorial Director at the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. Usually, I'm the one introducing people at these News Philanthropy Network events, so I'm excited to introduce myself and talk with everyone about how to use newsletters for fundraising. Here is a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start by just giving a brief overview of email more broadly for fundraising before we get into talking specifically about newsletters. And these are some things that I think are really exciting about what make newsletters terrific editorial news products. And we'll talk a bit about how that applies to fundraising as well. And then some time at the end for questions and discussion. And you'll see throughout also there is plenty of time for questions and designated spots I'll add throughout the presentation for specific discussion and questions. So feel free throughout or at those points to either raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you and would love for folks to participate. So it's not just me talking at you, or to drop questions or discussion in the chat. And we can hopefully make this really participatory and more of a discussion than a presentation. So to start, email for fundraising. I don't know about you, but this is often how I feel when I open my email inbox most mornings, and more often than not, it's in bed on my phone, which maybe isn't the healthiest thing as opposed to sitting down at a desk. But we all get a lot of email and it can be really overwhelming. And so despite all of that, email is still one of, if not the most effective communication channel for reaching audiences, in particular for fundraising. So it's a more competitive space, but it's an increasingly important space. And so we're going to talk for some strategies for how to stand out. But first, I wanted to set the ground a little bit and show the different types of emails you might be familiar with. So this is an email from Spotlight PA that they sent out this week. And this is just a pure fundraising email solicitation. I'm sure your news organizations do these as well. This is not a newsletter, but direct solicitation. This is a second type of email, which is more of a stewardship update kind of email. This comes from Report for America. I hope you all had a chance to watch the 60-minute segment on Sunday about local news. And so Report for America was featured in it. And so they sent out an email to their supporters and folks on their newsletter list, inviting people to participate in a discussion. So it's not an explicit fundraising ask, not a newsletter, but a way for others to engage with your reporting. And then newsletters, which is what we're going to be talking about today. These are, of course, editorial products. They come out of your newsroom. They are primarily mechanisms for sharing your reporting, but also great tools for utilizing fundraising. So this is where most of our attention is going to focus today. But I wanted to share a few stats more broadly about email before we get into newsletters specifically. And these statistics come from M&R Benchmarks. They are a consulting firm that do a really terrific digital fundraising benchmark survey every year. Email is a part of it, but they look beyond email. And in terms of journalism, they just focus on public media. So that's what we'll talk about here, but I think there are lessons to extrapolate for everyone. And so their 2021 survey, which looked at 2020, found that public media organizations raised $88 per 1,000 emails messages sent. And so that's not, so the example, if you sent out an email to a 10,000 person list, that's $880 per average newsletter send. Across nonprofit sectors, the average open rate was 21% in 2020, so an increase from 2019. So even though folks were getting more email, people were opening them, and nonprofit email volume increased 17% in 2020. And you'll see on the next slide also, public media organizations averaged 99 emails per subscriber, the largest of across nonprofit sectors. And what I thought was most interesting about this chart, which also comes from M&R, is the reason why public media organizations are so much ahead of all these other types of factors is because look how many more newsletters they send out. As news organizations, we have so much more access to content and coverage, and really that's the heart of what we do as publishers. And so being able to leverage that to reach your audience and to build fundraising on top of that is hugely important and a great advantage we have. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to talk about newsletters with everyone, and how we can use them both as editorial products and fundraising tools. So that was a lot. Feel free, if anyone has any questions, to jump into the chat or raise your hand. Happy to talk about it, but otherwise I can move on to talk more explicitly about newsletters. Any questions? All right. So over the course of the next little bit, we're going to talk about 4 reasons why I think newsletters are awesome, and also how that relates to fundraising. So the first is their habit forming. The second is they're customizable and flexible in terms of how you present coverage, but also calls to action for fundraising. The data is accessible and flexible, and also you own it, which is important. And finally, you can do all sorts of tests to see what works best and make sure that you're best serving your audience. So we'll get into all of these. So to start, the thing that's really exciting about email newsletters is that they're habit forming. I don't know about you, but I read a lot of email newsletters, and I tend to look for them a lot at the same time in the same day. And that's common across the world. This is research from the Reuters Institute at Oxford in the UK. And of people, they do an annual survey of news consumers all over the world. And of people who get news from newsletters, 96% of them get newsletters that are scheduled. So not breaking news emails, but newsletters that they expect to come in on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. So a regular cadence, so they know to look for it in their inbox. And we'll share some examples right after this of how news organizations across the country are leveraging that habituation to help improve their fundraising. But I just think about it from my own media consumption. For example, I'm an avid runner. I'm terrible at it. I'm slow. I don't go very fast, but I like to read about it. And so there's a terrific newsletter called The Morning Shakeout that publishes every Tuesday morning. And I wake up every Tuesday morning legitimately excited to have my coffee and read The Morning Shakeout to learn more about what's new in the running world and potential exercises. So if you can think about how your readers and your audience and your community is building habits and patterns of usage around your newsletters and are able to deliver them great coverage on a regular basis, that can go a long way to building your audience, building a loyal audience, and then ultimately building your fundraising base. So we're going to share a couple of examples. This first one comes from the INN Index, which is INN's terrific annual report about the state of nonprofit news. And this looked at the Montana Free Press, which is a digital nonprofit site in Montana. And so right at the beginning of COVID, like many news organizations, they were trying to meet their community's information needs. And so they started a daily COVID-19 newsletter as a way to reach more readers. Within a month, they had saw 15% growth in their newsletter list. And within 8 months, they saw a doubling of their email list. And so they ended 2020 with more than 8,000 email subscribers, which is significant growth. Obviously, beginning of the pandemic was a unique time and there was a lot going on. People were really hungry for news. But if you can, that lesson still applies, that if you can provide a regular cadence of news at a regular time that meets people's needs, they will read that, they will forward it to their friends, and your audience will grow. And I know the Free Press, that their fundraising and membership saw corresponding growth in response to their newsletter list. So just a reminder that publishing regularly and that habituation is important. Another example, this comes from the Northwestern Medill Local News Initiative, a great research group out of Northwestern's journalism school. And this is research that relates to digital subscriptions, but I think applies to fundraising as well. And their research found that the biggest predictor of whether someone will become a subscriber and retain and stay as a subscriber isn't time on page, isn't the number of articles they read, it's the frequency at which they read. And so the more often that someone is reading your coverage, the more likely it is that they will stay and support your work. And so that's an important reminder for fundraising as well, that if we can build that regular cadence, you can attract readers. And so for some newsrooms, it might be a daily newsletter. For some, that might be weekly or monthly, but it's worth doing audience research and looking at your analytics and talking to your community to see what they want and what they need and what your staff is capable of. We're not going to talk much about that type of audience research today, but happy to answer questions about it or send resources your way at a later date. This is another example from the newsletter guide, which is a resource guide we put together at the Lenfest Institute with the Harvard Shorenstein Center and some other partners a few years ago. And they found that we spoke with Vox Media and their director of newsroom analytics, and she said that of Eater, their food site, 6% of the page views came from newsletters, but 23% of loyal users' page views came from those same newsletters. So a disproportionately high number of their most loyal readers were newsletter readers, which I think is another point in this direction. And finally, I spoke with the Seattle Times a few years ago for a case study I did on them for my Solution Set newsletter. And they found that website visitors who are referred by a newsletter are 25 times more likely to subscribe than someone who came via Facebook. So that has to do with digital subscriptions, but again, same principle apply to fundraising. And so these are all some examples of how to do that, but there are other ways that we as news organizations can help habituate readers and give them a bit of a nudge to learn more about your news organization and get to the point where they're reading regularly and a consistent reader of your newsletter and newsroom's work. And that's an email onboarding series that typically we like to end in a donation ask. And so this is an automated email series, which you should be able to set up through your email service provider, a series of newsletters emails over a course of a week that as soon as someone signs up, they get a series of emails introducing them to your news organization, the newsletter. You can highlight the work of individual journalists. You can highlight some of the coverage you're most proud of, really to acclimate readers to your work, get them more familiar with your journalism and your staff, and then build up to a donation ask. It might not always be the most successful, but it's a way to continue to start that conversation with a reader. But News Revenue Hub, for example, found in some research they did a few years ago that setting up an automated welcome series earned organizations 10,000 more per month on average compared to clients who didn't have one. And on the right here on the screen is our own onboarding newsletter at the Lenfest Institute. So if you go in and sign up for our newsletter, which I hope you all subscribe at lenfestinstitute.org, this will be the culmination of a 5-part email series you get from us, highlighting the work of our partner organizations, and then ultimately building up to ask for a support for local news. And so we implemented this about 8 months ago. We started this onboarding series, and we have about a 50% open rate and about a 6% click to open rate, which means that for everyone who opened the email, about 6% of those clicked on an email. So we've gotten a handful of donations out of this, but it's also just another way to start that conversation with potential donors. So that was a lot of me talking, but would love to open it up to any questions and conversation, and be curious from everyone here. Does your organization have an onboarding series? What do you include? Do you see that it helps build that habituation and welcome and invite readers, ultimately lead to a donation? And are there other ways you are thinking about habit building and building a regular cadence or getting readers to expect and grow your newsletter? And would love any questions or thoughts you might have here. So I'll take a pause. Feel free to drop in the chat or raise your hand, and we can absolutely call on you. But Small Biz Philly, what kind of content do you put in newsletters? That's a great question. It really depends on your organization and what you are doing. So it's hard to say. There are a bunch of different formats you can try. You can have author-written newsletters. It can be primarily link-driven, where you're linking out to your own coverage or other coverage throughout the others in the space. It really depends on what your goals are as an organization, what you're hoping your newsletter achieves, and what your audience wants. And I'm happy to direct some resources to that. Lenfest Institute, what kind of content do we put out? That's a great question. So we have a few newsletters. Our primary newsletter, it's mostly updating folks on our research and grant support and what organizations we're working with are up to, and sharing all sorts of exciting things going on in local news. we don't have one at Root Quarterly, but only because we don't have the time/staff resources right now to have someone spend time on setting it up. We're trying to get there. That's a great point, Heather, that all of this takes time and depends on your staff resources. And the nice thing about an onboarding series is you can set it up once and let it go for a while. You occasionally want to update it for a time being, but it's once you get it going, it is a good question, is a good way to let it going. Caroline King, how often do you include an outright ask, or do you always include a donate button? That is a great question. We will get to more of that down the road. So stay tuned for that. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the next section, actually. What is your suggestion for Substack writers who charge for content through a paywall and also want to fundraise from specific donors? That's a great question. I'd be curious if anyone else has thoughts here on what to do. But you can, what we do often at the Lundfest Institute is we fundraise on behalf of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So this is a little bit different, but we're able to target specifically Inquirer subscribers. And so folks who are already loyal readers and already contributing to support the journalism, and we'll say, thank you for your support. We're really grateful. But if you can give a little more, this is what it enables. And we're really appreciative of that. So maybe that's a way to approach it for Substack, but totally defer to you. Heidi Thompson, the subscription offer in our welcome series is extremely effective. The second highest performing email campaign we send. That's awesome. Yeah, News Revenue Hub also has a great template. We've borrowed from them as well. I'm sorry, I saw there was a hand up also. I'm sorry I missed that. If you want to jump in, you're more than welcome to.
Yes, this is Dina from the 74 million. I actually, just going back to answering your initial question to the audience regarding a welcome series, I think it's very advantageous to the organization to do so. It's a great opportunity to engage your donors and some touch points there, but it does also allows, and it's been very effective as a touch point to go back again to after they gave the first donation. And as you were saying, go back, have some other touch points as an opportunity to share and express more about your organization so that your donor can get a little bit of a relationship, right, with the organization. But one of the things that we have begun to do, and in my new role at the 74, is I have kind of reached out to all of the editors and reporters and have them kind of do a Google Doc of all the information or all the coverages that they feel have made an impact, right? Whether it was shared or reshared or picked up through other news organizations, or whether it was requoted by the Senate or anything of that sort, so that we can then, or I can then go back, grab that information in the article, share that with our donors and prospective donors as another touch point.
Yeah, I think those are all terrific ideas. And really, it's the great thing about newsletters, it's a two-way communication mechanism as well. People can reply. And so it's about building that relationship and letting them know about all the terrific things you're doing and really starting a conversation. So thank you for those examples. I'll just run through a couple quick more questions here before moving onward. Chelsea asked, how many intros in a welcome series is best? How many is too many? I think it can vary. I think you want to have a regular cadence. So I would say at least 3 or 4, and you can go up to 6, 7, many, many more than that. I know some newspapers have more than 10, depending on how they're using the data and breaking them down. So I think I would suggest at least to start with 3 or 4 to show folks the breadth of the work. Good question here from Simone. Do you recommend separate newsletters to fundraise and editorial, or is it better to combine? I think it's helpful to have both, that sometimes you'll be wanting to send out separate explicit fundraising newsletters, but there really should always be some sort of fundraising ask within all your newsletters, and we'll showcase some examples of that in the next section. I'll just do one more question before moving on. This is a good one from Lisa. I want to develop a regular cadence, but our articles don't publish at the same day and time each week. We want to make new investigations available via newsletter when fresh. So timing is all over the map. So I think you could do a couple newsletters. ProPublica does a great newsletter called The Big Story, which we'll highlight in another section, but basically whenever they publish a big investigation, they send that out. So that can certainly be one product, but if you're looking to develop a regular cadence, and you can maybe think about aggregation or highlighting other news organizations' work that you think is really excellent also in addition to your own work, that if people are coming to your organization, they might value your opinion on other work as well. And that could be a good way to approach it. We're going to keep going. I totally understand there are a lot of questions and hopefully we'll get to more and we'll save the chat and I can reply to people directly also. The second thing that's really excellent about newsletters is that they're customizable. They're really flexible to meet the needs of your audience, your staffing capacities, as well as the news of the day. And so we'll start with an example talking about how a single newsletter evolved to meet a certain news story, and then I'll go into some examples about how you can do that for your fundraising asks as well. So this is the evolution of a newsletter to meet news needs. We're going to go back to March 2020, right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. These headlines were sort of a jolt to me when I was rereading them, preparing this. But the Philadelphia Inquirer decided to launch a COVID newsletter, and it launched it just as an RSS feed, basic headlines, just to get something out the door. And it started as daily updates. COVID news was changing so quickly that readers wanted daily updates. And so it was just initially a list of linked to stories. And then by later in the spring of 2020, they introduced some audience, some insight from journalists that had more of a human voice and was more human oriented. Then it has continued to evolve. And so this is the most recent issue of it. The Inquirer did a revamp of all their newsletters last year, and they created this newsletter to go in line with all that branding. So consistent branding across all your newsletters is valuable and important, but they also switched it to a weekly cadence. That there was COVID, while the pandemic is obviously still here, news wasn't as evolving as quickly and staffing changed. So that by going to a weekly cadence, it better served readers. So this is, I think, a really interesting example of how showing the flexibility of the newsletter platform, how design can evolve and what it can look like. And the same thing can happen with your fundraising ask also. So this is ProPublica, which we were just talking about as well. And one thing I love about their newsletters is that it has a donate button in the corner always, that it is there and consistent, and you see it no matter what their newsletter is. It doesn't interfere with the content, and it's a great starting point for newsletter asks. So if you're working in a news organization, maybe there's some tension with the newsroom, or some editors or journalists don't want fundraising asks impeding on editorial space. If that's a conversation you're having, this type of ask, which is prominent and effective, but not terribly overbearing, may be a good place to start. Here are a couple other options. That another way to do this is to place a big ask at the top of your newsletter. And some are big, some are not. And so from left to right, you can see Billy Penn. It's a pretty subtle ask. It's a way to encourage people to join and support the organization. Cal Matters as well, right there in bold at the top above the headlines. And then The City, which is a local newsroom in New York, that's a very big, quite prominent ask before the intro to the newsletter. Each of these serves different audiences. Each of these organizations maybe did some research or did some testing to see what works best for you. And we'll talk more about testing in a little bit, but you can experiment with different ways that meets the tone of your newsroom, meets the tone of your newsletter, and can be pretty effective in terms of reaching audiences. Another way to do this is within the body of the email as well. This is a little more blurring the lines between editorial and business, but if you're comfortable with it, people are reading your newsletter to read it. And so by including it in the body of the text, it's another way to introduce them to as a way to support your organization. And so this is what Bridge Michigan does. In the intro to their daily newsletter, thanks for reading Bridge Michigan. Please consider investing in our nonprofit newsroom. So a way to bring people in that way. Finally, if you're looking for a truly unobtrusive way to do this, you can put it way at the bottom of your email as well. So for example, on the left is Vox. They, even though they are for-profit, venture-backed newsroom, they offer individuals to support their work through what they call contributions. And so they make a very small, very inobtrusive ask at the bottom. And so that could be one way to go about doing this also. And then on the right is what we do at the Lenfest Institute. We will often do a more prominent inline ask at the beginning of our newsletters in the body of the text, but we always just have a support local journalism button at the bottom. And we consistently, it varies from newsletter to newsletter, but we'll get 1 or 2 donations per newsletter that come out of that. So I'll stop again for questions and discussion. Thank you everyone who's put stuff in the chat. But would be curious to hear from you. What are your newsletter's most successful CTAs? How have you thought about adding fundraising appeals to your newsletter? Have your fundraising appeals or your newsletter designs evolved to meet various moments? CTA is call to action, so the big buttons and things like that to encourage people to donate. Thank you for asking that. And are there any other challenges you faced in terms of newsletters? A really good resource also is reallygoodemails.com. It is a website that showcases different email design. It's broader than newsletters, it's broader than just designs, but it's a great place to look for inspiration from e-commerce marketing and things like that. Aaron White posted in the chat, our CTAs around legacy have been very good. What do you mean by legacy, if you don't mind me asking?
Sorry, if it's okay, I'll come in through the mic.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
So we just recently relaunched our legacy program, and as kind of I work for the Forward, which is kind of a legacy institution. We're just entering our 125th year. A lot of our donors have been subscribers off and on for 40 or 50 years. And so sending a call to action about living a legacy by giving to the Forward or helping us to create a longer kind of record of our news has been very effective. So really telling and communicating to our donors and to our subscribers that their gift helps to basically set our organization in stone and ensure that that media lives on through them. And that's been very effective.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think a really terrific example of knowing your audience and knowing what will appeal to them. And clearly it's working. And that's one of the really awesome things about having that legacy. You're able to draw on it. Bethesda Beat adds editorial newsletter toppers during membership campaigns. We find them to be most successful. We make them personal with a headshot and signature from our editor. That's a great insight, that if it feels like a person, someone you've gotten to know through your inbox who's asking you, that is a much different feeling. And I think that's thinking about it during different seasons as well, that during campaign season versus non-campaign season is a great way to think about it as well, if you're trying to put your toes in also in terms of adding more calls to action to your newsletter. For-profit community-based news portals, how can they do fundraising or support us? Kimmy, it's a lot of the same principles, I think. You have to have the mechanisms set up on the back end to be able to support that. If you want them to be tax deductible, then that means through a fiscal sponsor. But a lot of the same language, a lot of the same techniques should work for-profit newsrooms as well. You're providing a service to the community, you're serving an audience. It's I think, very similar beyond the mechanics of whether you can accept one-off support or contributions. I saw you came onto video also. Do you have any questions or anything you want to add there?
No, not right now, but thank you. This is really important information. I appreciate it.
Oh, terrific. Jess from Grist, we see success with CTAs at the top of the newsletter with a progress bar, as well as a bottom newsletter ask. I think that's fantastic. Also, a different way to showcase where you are and what someone's support will mean, and trying different things. Most effective has been pop-ups on the site, specifically targeting subscribers that make it to our site. These are time-based or scroll-based triggers. Yes, that's great. And we'll talk more about data and how to leverage data like that moving forward. That's not an example I included in the slides, but I think is a great way to do that, to link newsletter behavior to on-site behavior. You can do that to encourage folks who come from the newsletter and identify them to survive. Is it possible to fundraise for specific investigations, or is that problematic? I think that's a broader conversation. I totally defer to the fundraisers here for that. I know folks have often done fundraising for specific coverage areas. So I know the Texas Tribune, when there was initial interest around folks coming at the border and increased enforcement there, they wanted to send a reporter to the border a few years ago. So they launched a campaign, Help Us Support, to be able to fund a reporter to the border there as well. So that's one way to do it. We've experimented with asks at the top, and MailChimp reported lots of clicks on the donate link, but no actual donations. That's a great question. I think it could be Gmail or different email providers checking the links, but I think that if there is no donations coming through, you would expect that that might be the case. And it might be a way to rethink your landing page also. We're not going to talk about that so much here in terms of best practices, in terms of checkout flow and things like that, but generally simpler is better. The least information you can get from people to process the donation. So I think figuring that out is a good way to do it. And metrics have been impacted across the newsletter space also, especially recently by Apple's recent privacy change, that people have seen increased open rates and things like that. So that could be a way through. Nikki, what is your suggestion for newsletter tools to use? There are so many options: MailChimp, HubSpot, Klaviyo. What aspects should we consider when choosing a newsletter tool? That is a great question. We don't get into it specifically here, but it really depends on your organization. There's cost involved, there's setup fees involved, and ongoing fees that many of them charge based on the number of subscribers. So if you're planning to grow, what might start off as a relatively cheap option could get more expensive pretty quickly. Another thing to consider is the level of analytics and level of connection that you want to other aspects, and whether you want to process payments. So for example, Substack, really easy to get set up on and just start publishing. You just set up an account and go, but their analytics aren't as good, and it won't necessarily hook up to your existing donor database compared to something like MailChimp that is much more flexible and has the details built in. Nikki, also another great question on Apple Mail privacy changes. Have folks had to deal with that? Our open rates have increased a little, but haven't seen anything terribly significant. And I've seen folks recommend looking at other metrics like click-through rate and things like that as a way to offset that and better provide more details, but would be curious what people have seen. Yeah, Lee's saying our open rates have increased by 17% since Apple Mail privacy protection. So yeah, feel free to keep talking about that in the chat. We're going to talk about metrics and data in.
How should this one be coded?
Oh,
just in case I make a deposit this week.
Someone came off mute, so just make sure that you're on mute, please. But we'll be talking about metrics in just a few minutes, and so we can come back to that, and would be curious what other folks are seeing as well. Data and metrics. So good timing on that front. Yes, Katie, Dan Oshinsky's coverage is really great. Not a Newsletter is an amazing resource and would recommend you all subscribe. But one of the things I love about email newsletters and what make them so valuable is that you control the relationship with the reader, you own the data. Unlike publishing on Facebook or other platforms, their relationship is directly with you, and it's exportable, and you're able to pair it with other data, especially if you have an existing CRM and existing data around your donors, and you can create really powerful segmentation and really powerful targeting to target specific supporters. However, a word of caution, it's really important, as always, journalism and philanthropy are both based on trust, and it's important to treat your readers with respect. And there are legal limits on what you can do with email addresses as well. It varies from country to country, in some cases state to state. And I am not a lawyer, much to my mother's disappointment, so I'm happy to send you resources on legal rules replying regarding email and data privacy and things like that, but that's always something to consider as well. So thinking about data and metrics in a couple of ways, here are some very basic newsletter metrics. There are some great places to start to think about and start to look when you're thinking about how to assess the success of your newsletter. We've been talking a little bit in the chat around Apple Mail and privacy, and so it can give you a sense of some of the challenges. None of these are always perfect, but they, depending on what you're trying to understand and what your goals are, these are some places to look as well. You can also should have data, hopefully, of your donors as well. In a CRM, something like Salesforce or another database, the giving history, giving capacity if you're doing wealth screening, so you can understand the willingness of, or the capacity of people to give, and potentially, hopefully, pair that capacity by looking at their email activity, and that might show their willingness and what they are hopefully able to give. We talked about donation sources. You can track links to understand where people are coming in from the donations, attendance at events or other things, so you know how they've interacted with your organization in the past, and individual communications with staff. So if you are having one-on-one communications with donors, you can log that in your CRM also, and that could be data you can lean on as well. So this is just a small example that I really love of how this comes together. Spotlight PA is a nonprofit newsroom based in Harrisburg covering statewide issues in Pennsylvania. We support them very closely at the Lenfest Institute, and I personally am a member. I think they do great work, and I'm very happy to support them. And because they know that I am a member in their CRM Salesforce, and also that I am a newsletter subscriber in their ESP, email service provider, MailChimp, they're able to link those through. They use the News Revenue Hub, which supports that, and they can set up a conditional formatting within the newsletters, which is what you see in the coding on the right. So if SPA Dona 365 true, so if someone's donated in the past 365 days, if that's true, then they add in this little note, thank you for being a member, at the top of the newsletter, which to me as a supporter opening the email every day, it's such a small message, but a really clear one that shows that they value my small contribution. And that's one of those things you can set up and forget and is pretty easy to do. So that's the type of thing on a small scale and on a larger scale, by sending targeted solicitations potentially to readers who read a certain amount and haven't donated, or folks who've donated asking them to give again, that type of thing. But there are lots of ways to pair data, and we can talk more about that. So pause for discussion and questions. Sorry for me talking a lot, but does your news organization combine donation data and email data? And if so, how? And are there other ways you're thinking about segmenting your audience or sending targeted appeals or stewardship messages? Can sponsorship in newsletters also be included in overall fundraising efforts? Would be curious how you think about that, but I think it depends on the type of sponsorship, and certainly news organizations should absolutely be selling sponsorships and banner ads in their newsletter, and that can certainly coexist with donation callouts and things of that nature as well. Our e-news database is not connected to our CRM, so I'm struggling with efficiency. Yeah, that's really difficult, and it might be worth, depending on the level of sophistication and what your capacity is, investigating whether that's possible. But at the very least, you can potentially, MailChimp and other similar platforms have really robust tagging capabilities. So you can download a CSV file maybe of all your donors and then upload that to your email provider, and you can then tag the donors so you can your system will know, even if it's not doing it automatically, you can manually every week, every month, however, what cadence you want to do to do that. It's not necessarily necessary to have a CRM to do that. You can manually upload the list of donors to be able to do that in your system and create that conditional tagging within your ESP, and happy to walk folks through that offline if they have questions about that. I really appreciate Heidi's comment on MailChimp's built-in rating system. That is a really great way to easily segment people. You don't have to have a CRM or a ton of data to be able to do that. It's built in, and the higher the rating, the more active and more likely they are probably to support you because they're an active and eager newsletter reader. So that is a really terrific tip. How acceptable is sponsored content as a revenue source for newsrooms? We're seeing it more frequently used, but are curious. Yeah, Chelsea, that's a great question. I think a little beyond the scope of this talk, but happy to talk about it. I think as long as it's labeled appropriately, that is totally fine. And maybe that's a topic we dig more deeply into in the future, but I think is perfectly within the bounds. Jess at Gris, we target repeat donors in a fiscal year as a segment to try and convert to monthly sustaining members. You can also target a certain one-time amount, perhaps $75, $150 to convert to monthly donors. That's a great idea. Yeah, Lisa, that's also, that's a challenge. I think that goes back to the Apple issue as well, that there are limitations to all these data sources. So I think take everything with a grain of salt, but there are lots of ways to go about doing it, and use your intuition and don't just solely rely on the computers, I suppose. Terrific. I'm going to go to our last segment, and then we'll hopefully save some time at the end for questions and broader discussion. And feel free to raise your hand if you want to jump in offline as well, or on video and audio as well. So a really great thing to do also is to be testing. And so A/B tests show your audience two variations of the same element within your newsletter, and then we'll determine which is more effective. And so there's A/B testing and other types of testing as well, but you can test everything from the subject line of a newsletter to see what performs best, to who the name of the person the email comes from, the color of buttons and calls to action within the newsletter. There are all sorts of things you can test, and all sorts of ways you can see what readers and users reply better to. MailChimp typically recommends you have at least 5,000 subscribers to do A/B testing, just to make sure that they're statistically significant. But if you have fewer subscribers, it's still worth doing. There are less formal ways to do it. You can just send one version one week, another version another week, and eyeball and see what does best, or ask even for more qualitative feedback. Just put in the body of the email, hey, we're trying something new this week. Maybe you can reply and let us know. That is the great thing about email. It's a two-way communication platform. So this is just like a very simple example of what an A/B subject line tests. I subscribe to Axios's email, and I guess they have me in their system twice or something, because I got both the A section and the B section of the test of the same email. But you can see what they're doing, trying to see whether Biden's Iran nightmare or Biden's doubts performs better. So I wanted to share an example of what we've done with this at the Lenfest Institute, and also a word of caution to think and look more deeply at the data and how you're thinking about testing, and really to frame it around what your goals are. So this is not from a newsletter, admittedly. This is from a solicitation email, but I love the example. So if you indulge me, I included it. So we A/B tested headlines for a one-day match we were running around fundraising on behalf of the Inquirer. And so these were the two subject lines we were running. We were planning a morning email and an afternoon email. And so the test, these were the two subjects. Combo 1 was the winning subject. It had a higher open rate, that 24.7% open to say thanks to the Philadelphia Inquirer's journalists. So then that went out to the rest of the group. But then once we examined the actual email and what came out of it, we saw that more donations actually came from the group that got today only your investment in essential reporting matched dollar for dollar. And so that was our ultimate goal. And so that was our target. So even though we got a higher open rate from the other subject line, and that's what we were testing, really the goal and what we were trying to accomplish was donations. And so we ended up going for the next email again with a subject line that focused on the match and focused on the fundraising, and did more testing around that concept as opposed to this saying thanks. So that is a bit of a long-winded way of saying just to don't test for testing's sake, but really keep a goal in mind and work toward that, and understand what you're trying to achieve. And the data and the analytics and the testing can help light the way around that. So that's all I have there. So open it again for discussion and questions. Have your news organizations run any tests? What have that looked like? And if you haven't, do you have ideas for things that maybe you'd want to test, or what that could look like? If anyone doesn't have any questions, I'll wait a second to drop in the chat. Can you talk a bit about segmentation? Yes, absolutely. So segmentation, there are all sorts of ways to do it. We were talking about using the star system in MailChimp, but it's really about providing targeted content to targeted sections of your audience. And so you're able to send more specific message depending on what your goal is. So for example, you send to readers a donation ask to people who have read more of your coverage, have engaged with it more, have clicked through the website more, that because they're more engaged with your content, they're more likely to subscribe and donate. So you send your message to that. But there are all sorts of ways on how you can segment audience. And I'd be curious to open it up to folks here. Are there other ways that you're thinking about segmentation, and what does that look like for you? I hope that answered your question, Kimmy. I'm sorry if that was a bit rambly.
Okay, do you have any suggestions about what is good, like what I would want to target, and what I would want to know about my audience, and any tools that are useful for tracking that, and for creating like I'm imagining like a unified database where I only have like one entry per reader, but they may be receiving multiple newsletters or requests for funding.
Yeah, I think it depends on what your goal is. And so I'm seeing Jackie Palmer, hi Jackie, is posting some comments. We segment based on give amounts, engagement levels, time on newsletters, etc. So I think that's a great way to do it. So if folks have been subscribers for a long time, they may be more engaged or more interested, or maybe they're not interested, and you can send them a newsletter saying, hey, you are on here but haven't opened one in a long time. Do you still want to get our emails? And you can use that as a way to kick people off who are dragging you down a little bit. So happy to chat more offline about it if there are more specifics. But if anyone else has any questions about this, or questions more broadly, that's it for my presentation. Hopefully next time you read your email, you feel more like her as opposed to the stressed out fellow at the beginning, but happy to answer any questions. How are you creating your A/B lists? We do it through MailChimp, and it just does it automatically, that it will create random segments of your audience. And I think that's the best way to go about doing it scientifically. Kat Tracy, I'd be curious if attendees are in the role of marketing in their organizations. Yeah, if anyone here is on the marketing end, feel free to raise your hand or jump in and think about how you're thinking about this otherwise beyond from a newsroom perspective. That's a great question, Sherry, in the chat. Also, any suggestions on ways to leverage social media to build your audience? Yeah, I would feel free to tweet out links to subscribe to your newsletter. We publish all of our newsletters as posts on our website also, and we'll include a subscription link in the body of the newsletter and on the website. And so we will tweet out the story, post it across platforms like any other story we publish. And so by directing people to the newsletter, they find it interesting. They can sign up directly in the story as well. Depending on what email service provider you use, also, there are ways to do it directly. So if you're publishing on Review, which Twitter owns now, you can sign up directly from Twitter, which is, I think, a pretty cool feature if your audience is on Twitter a lot. Do you give part of content? Sorry, let me scroll up. I missed that. Do you give part of content in social and link for more, or do you do them on the same website? We do both. That we'll link on social media, and we will publish the full thing on the website and include different call out language on social media depending on it. We just tried a payment reactivation effort that reactivated some people we lost as well, and I highly recommend everyone try that. We targeted folks who became inactive due to credit card failure and missing credit cards in their profiles. That's a great idea. Oftentimes, people won't renew just because their credit card changes, and so would be open to renewing if they know more. So I think that's a terrific suggestion. James from the Keene Sentinel. I work with digital community engagement with the Keene Sentinel. Most of our work has been with social media and our website's role in audience engagement. We've used references to our social media in our weekday newsletter. I like the idea of cross-posting to a website, social media, or signing up directly. Should fundraising efforts be anchored to the main website or dispersed in newsletter editions? Would be curious what you mean by that. Can you explain, sort of elaborate what you mean?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question. Actually, this thing about, a lot of the newsletters end up in people's inboxes, and I work with Substack, so most of the content is on Substack. But I think the journalistic initiative is wider than the newsletter itself, right? Like different kinds of communications, projects, and so on. So I think that the website should, have a wider presence, and very clear fundraising asks should be part of the main website, or it just gets lost in the editorial content.
Yes, absolutely. Your website is your best platform for digital fundraising. It is the first thing people see. There should be prominent fundraising callouts, whether it's on your website or pop-ups. There are all sorts of different things you can try out. And I think that's a broader conversation than this conversation, and certainly something we can discuss as part of the News Philanthropy Network and do future presentations on best practices for that. So we have about 5 minutes left. Let me know if anyone else has any questions. Otherwise, we can give you back some of your time. If you have any other questions moving forward, please feel free to reach out over email. We'll send everyone a copy of this slide deck with links to all the resources I mentioned, a recording if you feel so inclined to watch me speak at you again, and more details about other upcoming News Philanthropy Network programming. Our next course is going to be application only, focused on grant writing strategies. So we're going to be announcing that in the next week or so, and that's going to start in late April. So more on that hopefully soon. So thank you everyone for being here.
Hey, this is Small Biz Philly. Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just real quick, for someone that has a for-profit organization, should they approach their content differently than someone that has a nonprofit?
I don't think so. I think it is very similar ideas in terms of providing value to the community, to your readers, convincing them why it's worth supporting. Maybe some of the language will change, that if you're for profit, it's not going to be a tax deductible donation, but there's certainly, I think, very similar conceptually in terms of how you approach it.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else? We're happy to stick around for a few more minutes if folks want to chat or have any other questions, but thank you all for being here. All right, have a good one, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon, and take care.